In this segment, we're going to take a look at Ambience Quilting, and the tool for that is found here in the editing toolbar, Ambience Quilting. So to get started, I think I should probably try just opening up an embroidery design. So again, I'm going to look in the embroidery album folder, and I'll just select one of the designs that came installed with the Digitizer software. So here we have the little flowers in a basket design, and I'm going to zoom out. And what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm just going to give myself a larger embroidery hoop, so we have some space around it. The idea is Ambience Quilting is for designing decorative quilt blocks. So for example, I'm going to just go Control A to select this embroidery design, and now you can see the tools become available. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on Ambience Quilting. So in here, I have some settings. Now first of all, I set the block size to 200 millimeters because that's the size of my embroidery hoop. It's a 200 millimeter hoop, so that's what I'm going to choose. Now you have the actual stitching. So there's different types. You've got echo, or you can go with scroll or stipple, and then you have echo clipped and scroll clipped. So we'll take a look at the different types just so we can see the difference. And then you have the design margin, the block margin, and the line spacing. The design margin is the distance from your embroidery design to the first part of the echo quilting. And the block margin is the opposite. It's the distance from the last line of the echo quilting to the actual shape of the block itself. So that says leave a 5 millimeter space around the 200 millimeter hoop, or 200 millimeter block, I guess is what it is. And then you have the line spacing. That's the distance between each line. And I have them all set at 5, but they don't have to be the same. They could be different. And then you get to choose a color. For what color are these new embroidery objects going to be? And it tells you the design size, and it tells you for your block center to use either the design center, or you can digitize the center of the block. So I'm going to go ahead and just use the design as the center of the block, set on echo with everything set at 5 millimeters, and say OK, just so we can see what the first one looks like. Okay, so you can see here what happens. Basically, with a 5 millimeter space from the outside of my embroidery design, it creates a line that follows around that shape, and it continues to create lines that follow around that shape until it gets to the square, and then it starts to create squares to complete the rest of the block. And that's the option called echo. Now I'm going to just undo, Control A to select all, and run the tool again and change nothing except for change it to scroll, and say OK. Now it looks very similar to the echo, but the only difference here is with scroll, the lines do not end. So looking at the part that goes around the embroidery design, it starts right here, and the line just continually gets longer and longer, and it's actually quite an optical illusion, but it ends right here. So in echo, all of these things were little completed lines, and each line around the design was a complete line, and then it jumps to the next line and continues on. So that's a small difference, but echo and scroll are certainly very similar. Now I'm just going to choose undo, and again Control A to select the embroidery design, and we'll try the third option, which is stipple. Now when I change it to stipple, I'm going to say OK, and I'll leave everything else the same and say OK. And so what it did this time was it simply stippled inside of the block around, and again it's got a 5 millimeter space here in between the block, or the outside of the block, and it's got a 5 millimeter space in between the embroidery, and then it's got 5 millimeter spacing for the stippling. Now I'm going to choose undo, and I'm going to go again, Control A, and we'll take a look at some of the combining options. So echo clipped basically is what this one's called, and I'll say OK. So now you can see the difference. Instead of having those, I guess, squares around the outside, it just keeps making the shape of the design over and over, and then you have like these little clipped lines, I guess is what they're called, to finish off the block, but not, they can't obviously connect the shapes because they go outside of the block. So I think that makes sense. And why don't we do it again one more time, Control A, and this time we'll do scroll clipped. which you can probably guess it's going to look very similar, except for it's a scroll line versus an echo line. So that's very interesting. Now I'm going to undo, and again, Control A, taking a look at the tool. So some of the other options, first of all, you can change your block size. So I was only going with a 200 millimeter block size because I was dealing with my 200 millimeter hoop, but you could change this to be larger if you wanted to have a 300 millimeter block size. That's fine. It'll actually go outside of your embroidery hoop. In this case, I'll just hide the hoop. So it can really be any size that you want it to be. But certainly it makes more sense, to try and make this fit inside of one of your embroidery hoops. Now, Control A. But there really are no limits. You just never know what you're going to get. Why don't we go with 150? And so it's a little bit smaller this time. And so there would be lots of room inside of your embroidery hoop for the Echo or Ambience Quilting. So let's see. Some of the other options were the spacing in here, and then the Digitize Center versus the Design Center. So why don't I go back to just the plain old Echo, and first of all, I'm going to change the design margin to be larger. I'll make that 10 millimeters, and I'll make the block margin larger. I'll make that 10 millimeters, but I'll leave the line spacing at 5 so you can see it really clearly. See now, and my block size here, I better undo that. My block size was only 150, so why don't I make that back to the 200 hoop that I'm using. So we have 10 millimeters from the design, the Echo quilting will start, and 10 millimeters from the edge of the block, it'll stop. So I'll say OK. So you can see there's the 10 millimeter space there, and there's the 10 millimeter space there, but there's just a 5 millimeter space in between all of the lines. So yeah, I'm just going to keep creating different quilt blocks. So if you wanted to go with something maybe a little bit less obvious, so I'll use 4 millimeters for those two, and here I'm going to go with like 2 millimeters in between the line spacing, and you'll see I'll get lots of lines this way. Okay, so really it's up to you, the quilter of the bunch, to decide exactly what your quilt blocks would be like to look at, but you can see that with Ambience Quilting you certainly have a lot of options available to look at. Now one more thing, I'm just going to go Control A, and one more time, but this time I'm going to leave all of these things set the same, but I'm going to choose Digitize Center versus Design Center. So when I say Digitize Center and say OK, before it does the quilting, it gives me a block, and it basically wants me to decide where the block goes. So for example, imagine my hoop's not there at the moment. We'll just ignore my embroidery hoop. Instead of putting it right here in the center, I could offset that quilt block and put my embroidery design in one of the sort of top left quadrant. So I'm going to click right here. And so what it does is it starts the Ambience Quilting around that area and then finishes off the block. So you can see that I basically was able to offset it that way. So that's the tool called Ambience Quilting, and as you can see there's really a lot of features that can be changed to give you different looks for your quilt blocks.